Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's session of Monthly Current Affairs, where we take a look at all the current affairs related topics for environment and ecology for the month of October. And thereby, we take a look at the topics relevant slightly for the mains examination, the important reports, the species in news, as well as the protected areas in news. So, if we take a look at the overall topics that shall be covered today, so some of the important topics from where you can expect a direct question in the prelims as well as the mains exam associated with the production gap report, CMS report. Now, what these are and what species do they cover? That is something that we are going to cover in greater detail. Tiger outside the Tiger Reserves initiative. This is a new initiative, a fresh initiative to bring about a greater conservation of the tiger species and tiger population in our country. Then, State of Finance for the Forest Report 2025. Now, this is the first time that the State of Finance for Forest Report has been generated. With the help of this, we shall also be taking a look at the concept of which are the countries which are getting greater amount of finance and where does India stand? What is the issue with the tropical countries and where is it that in our country we can improve the level of financing? Then the concept of carbon capture, usage, and storage. Now, this is again a report which has been generated. It is about the Asian countries and their endeavor when it comes to carbon capture. In this, we shall also be taking a look at the four different methodologies of carbon capture, and we shall try to understand that how CCUS is not as productive as it is deemed to be, and rather than that, it is much more advisable to switch on to renewable form of energy. Then why has IUCN red flagged the Western Ghats in order for conservation purposes? And synchronous All India Elephant Estimation of 2021 to 2025. This is about the various different zones. So, which are the population zones of elephant? Which state has got the largest population of elephants? And also, where do we expect, which are the couple of states where the elephant population has declined by more than 50%? And as a consequence, where the elephant migration is happening. Then the species in news that we are going to cover, seven different species. So 23 for 23 initiative that is going to cover the portion of snow leopards. Then the project Sloth Bear, which has been launched by our country on the eve of the Wildlife Week. Then painted stork. Then a new species of eel has been discovered around the region of the Kanyakumari coastline. Then Indian wolf. IUCN for the first time has completed a study of Indian wolf. Then Blackbuck, reintroduction of Blackbuck population has been a successful exercise in the state of Chhattisgarh, where in Chhattisgarh and some properties of Blackbuck as well. Then Carabid beetle, they turn out to be bioindicators for the microplastics. What do we mean by microplastics? And whether carabid beetles turning out to be bioindicators, what do we mean by that? These are some of the important aspects. Then we shall also be covering some of the protected areas in news, new Ramsar sites. A couple of new Ramsar sites have been declared, then Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve and the Dugong Sanctuary. These three have been the protected areas in. What I would advise you is take a look at each one of these particular topics, understand the important aspects. Majority of the reports we have tried to explain it with the help of the figures, the data pointers, and the graphs so that it is easier for you to revise as well. And I would also suggest to you that take a look at the multiple choice questions at the end of these topics and try to solve it at your own end as well. Having said that, what are the sources for all these portions of current affairs? So the sources, they cover the newspapers of the Hindu, the Indian Express, and the magazine of Down to Earth. Along with that, the reports, they have been directly taken from the UN website. UN website. Okay. Other than that, also the newspaper of Hindustan Times that has also been instrumental in giving the reports of some of the species in news. So these are the various different sources for all the portion of the current affairs for the month of October. Okay. Now, having said that, before we initiate the discussion for the first topic, an announcement for all of you. That is, we are initiating the 3 day special class festival from 3rd of November, where you can get and avail live sessions with the top educators. You can avail the instant doubt resolution, doubt solving, and get an idea about the basic concepts of some of the very important subjects relevant for your examination. Now, having said that, we start with the first topic of the day, and that is Production Gap Report 2025. So, first of all, we'll try to understand that what do you mean and what do we mean by the case of Production Gap Report? What does it tell us? Whether it is positive, whether it is negative, and on what basis should we chart out a way forward? So, first of all, when we say Production Gap Report, what do we mean by that? So, let us understand this. First things first, when we talk about, let's suppose, climate goals, climate ambitions, as of now, climate goals are driven by the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement. Now, various different countries who are party to the Paris Agreement or United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, all of them have committed to restrict the level of global warming. Now, to restrict the level of global warming, what is the aim? The aim is to limit it to almost around 2 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. Okay? By the year 2100. And here, basically, if possible, the Paris Agreement also talks about the fact that if possible, the warming shall be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, as compared to what? As compared to the pre-industrial era, that is prior to the industrial revolution, pre-industrial era. Okay. Now, here, when we say pre-industrial era and the case of limiting the level of warming, we have to understand that the emission of greenhouse gases is causing a greater amount of warming across the globe, isn't it? Now, these greenhouse gases are produced how? By economic activities as well as by utilization of fossil fuel like coal, combustion of coal, petroleum, natural gas, all the various different types that we have. So the combustion of these, that also produces the greenhouse gas, which overall leads to the level of warming. So if we want to restrict or if we want to reduce the level of warming, what is required to be done or what is advisable? The requirement thereby is to limit the use of fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels. Okay. Fossil fuels production, fossil fuel combustion. Because please get one thing very clear. It is not just the burning of the fossil fuel which produces greenhouse gases. Even the production, the marketing of fossil fuels. That is, for example, if you are extracting crude oil, if you are extracting coal. Now, even in those cases, gases like methane, they get emitted on a day-to-day basis. As a consequence, these gases like methane, they end up in the atmosphere, increasing the level of warming. So, if you want to limit the level of warming, let's assume that with the passage of time, you need to have a reduction in the use of fossil fuels, right? This is the advised advised path, pathway. Okay. Now, in reality, if the countries they did follow this kind of a fossil fuel usage or production, then maybe the level of warming across the world could have been limited. But the reality is different. Reality is that the production of fossil fuels is quite high. As a consequence, there is a gap in terms of what is desired to be produced and what is actually produced. This gap, this is the actual, and this the lower one is the desired production. So as a consequence, this is what is referred to as the production gap. Production gap. Okay. So that is how you basically have the assimilation or basically the compilation of the data across the various countries, talking about that what should be the country's strategy, like India's strategy, in order to meet the climate goals, and how much is India actually trying to produce or aiming to produce. So that is the highlight of the production gap report. Having said that, once we know what the production gap report is, what are amongst the key major findings of the production gap report? We have to understand that various different countries, they had committed as per their INDC, that is the commitment that you make as per the requirements of the Paris Agreement, that we will only produce certain amount of fossil fuel and we will go ahead with the curtailing of the fossil fuel production in the future. Now, many of the countries have taken a departure from that. As compared to the previous ambition, as compared to their previous programs, they have actually initiated an increased production of coal, petroleum, crude oil, natural gas, and so on. Coal is one of those particular fuel resources where the production is increasing. Take the case of countries like India itself. When we talk about country like India, we are well on our way to increase the renewable energy potential in our energy mix. But having said that, a country like India with a rising population, with a growing economy, is such an energy hungry country that it requires much more amount of energy being produced. And that is why even countries like India, they are aiming to increase the fossil fuel consumption. Germany is also another one of those ideal examples. Germany, for that matter, for a long period of time, and this is quite interesting, where you talk about energy security, and energy security is an important aspect. Now, Germany as a country had developed a lot of capacity in terms of nuclear power generation. Nuclear power is also a clean form of energy, by the way. Now, nuclear power generation, nuclear potential, that was putting Germany well on its path of clean energy. But then, due to the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and also the politics, the green politics which happened in Germany, due to which you have the formation of coalitions, now one of the environmentalist parties wanted the dismantling of all the nuclear installations. Germany, under Angela Merkel, went ahead and put a closure to all the various different nuclear power plants over a period of time. Then Germany replaced that source of energy from the gas and the oil supply from countries like Russia. Now, when the Russia Ukraine conflict broke out, then Germany cut off the supply of oil and gas from Russia. So think about it. Germany now did not have nuclear power supply. Germany now also did not have the supply of crude oil or gas from Russia. So, how would it fulfill its own gas requirements or energy requirements? That is when Germany started exploiting coal, importing coal, and burning coal. So, rather than going down the path of clean energy, Germany started burning more amount of fossil fuel. Like that, UK is also one of those countries where, due to increased inflation of the energy prices, in UK also started increasing the usage of coal. So various different countries, they have deviated from their pathway of clean energy and they have started producing and plan to use much more amount of fossil fuel. That is highlighted as per the production gap report. Now, majority of these reports, they get generated prior to the conference of parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The conference of parties number 30 to UNFCCC is going to be held in the coming week in Belém in Brazil. So these reports, they are generated prior to that, so that the heads of states, the various different governments, and also the decision makers, they have ample amount of information with them to make a decision for a better environment. Okay, energy security basically is that you have ample amount of energy in order to fulfill the demands of all the economic activities and all the citizenry as well. So that is the case of energy security. Now, when we talk about the production gap report, so it is basically an annual report released by which organization? That also becomes important for your prelims. So which organization releases that production gap report? So Stockholm Environment Institute, Climate Analytics, and International Institute for Sustainable Development. These are the three organizations which are responsible. Again, repeat that: Stockholm Environmental Institute, Climate Analytics, and International Institute for Sustainable Development. This becomes vital for your prelims. And all the PDF shall be provided in the Telegram group. So you can join the Telegram group and you will get the PDF, the annotations of the PDF at the end of the session as well. Now, what is the aim? To track the discrepancy or the gap which does exist between the government's planned fossil fuel production and the amount of fossil fuels which are required, which are needed to limit the level of warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, as has been committed or has been outlined as per the Paris Agreement. Now, that is what is the production gap, right? Production gap. Now, what does the report highlight? What are some of the key findings? So, the governments in aggregate still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuel into 2030 than what would be required to limit the warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, regardless of the level of warming already in the past decade, various regions of Europe, they have experienced a level of warming by almost 3 degrees Celsius. Now, that might be temporary, but nonetheless, it has unraveled the ecosystem in an unprecedented manner. It has started melting the permafrost regions, it has brought about heat waves, and it has brought about an extraordinary spell of dry conditions and drought like situations. Now, the persistence of the global production gap puts a well managed and equitable energy transition at risk. Okay. Why does it put at risk? Because understand another thing and understand an analogy here. Let's assume you, as a candidate, you know that you need to study 8 hours in order to clear the civil services exam. Let's suppose, and everybody knows that every day you need to put in 8 hours. But instead of those 8 hours, as a candidate, what you are doing is right now you are only devoting 1 hour or 2 hours, right? Thinking about it, that one fine day I will make up for it. Now, the month of November passes, the month of December passes, the month of January passes, February passes. Now, when you are in the month of March, you will have a lot to make up for. That is something which will humanly be impossible for you to make up for. So, what does that mean? You will always be left behind, and in that case, you won't be able to clear the exam as well. Similarly, when we talk about and fit the analogy in the case of the production gap, all the various countries who are thinking about a clean transition, if they transition to clean energy faster or sooner, they will be able to limit the level of warming. But if they continue to burn the fossil fuel for a longer duration of time, for a greater period of time, then for them, the transition becomes that much tougher at the end of the day. They will have to take much drastic measures in order to have a transition to renewables. Many of the countries won't be able to do that. And even if they do that, it might be very late, where you can have irreversible and irreparable damage, which is caused to the ecosystem already. So that is where the transition, equitable energy transition, that in itself can be put at. Now, observe the data pointers. So the data pointer highlights the global fossil fuel production. Now, it is represented in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Now, overall, if you observe this, then this represents the amount of production required to meet the 2 degrees Celsius warming pathway. This one represents the purple one, represents the amount of production which is required in order to fulfill the warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And what is the reality? The reality is, as per the government plans and projections, this is the topmost part, is the reality. So the production gap is massive. And the production gap, as you can see, by the year 2030, it is set to increase rather than decreasing. The production gap is set to increase. So that is the finding of the production gap report. Okay. Now, here You will also find the case that the governments now plan even higher level of coal production up to around 2035 and gas production up to around 2050 than they did in 2020. So, what were the government's targets in 2020? Now, the aim of production is much higher. Take the case of India itself. Right now, we are going gaga over, or we are celebrating the fact that you have a large amount of crude oil and gas reserves, which are possibly and potentially present in the region of Andaman Nicobar Islands, isn't it? Now, think about it. We are exploring it right now. Now, it will take a couple of years to get an exact idea of the total amount of oil and gas reserves in Andaman Nicobar Island and around that. And again, another 5 to 10 years for a meaningful production to start. So, a country like India will start producing oil and gas from those reserves around Andaman by the year 2030, 2035. So, obviously, the production won't happen for 1 year or 2 years. The production will continue for a few decades altogether in order to provide us enough amount of energy for our economic growth, for our economic independence, for our import independence. So, that is where whatever the plans of the governments were by 2023, the production is said to outpace that. Okay, why coal production is going to increase? Because many of the governments, when they had committed that by 2030 we will do this, by 2025 we will do this, so all that plan that they had submitted up till 2023, they find themselves woefully short of energy. And this is also a kind of a vicious cycle. Please understand this. We know that the global temperatures are rising. So the requirement of cooling, etc., particularly in the tropical countries, that is going to increase. So the energy demand is going to increase. Now, what do the governments do? The government, suppose a government like the government of India. Now, will the government of India allow its citizens to live in absolute darkness or without energy? No, that will be detrimental both in terms of the social sustainable development as well as for the economic development of the nation. So as a consequence, the governments, they have to produce more amount of fossil fuel based energy because they don't have enough potential or enough finances, enough technology to simply switch to renewables. Because renewables, they take a lot of time, they take ample amount of investment and large amount of capital infusion as well. For example, we are building a new dam across Subansiri. Now, that dam is going to generate close to around 2000 megawatts. But the construction of that dam, that has been going on for a long period of time, isn't it? For almost 10 to 15 years before it getting completely commissioned and getting in tune with the grid. So the renewables have a very long gestation period for them to be materialized. That is why you basically need right now, in order to plug the energy gap, in order to fulfill the energy scarcity, you need to produce those fossil fuels as governments, as various different countries. That is why the countries are seeking to increase the production of coal, crude oil, gas, and so on. Okay. Now, planned oil production continues to increase all the way up till 2050. The oil production, right? Even that is something which will increase. And the best example of that, we have already taken the case of the Andaman gas reserves, oil reserves that we have found. So if there is presence of oil and gas there, definitely we will be producing. So overall, take a look at the oil production. Oil production basically, as compared to the planned estimate or the requirement of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, the oil production is set to increase. So the production gap is going to increase. When we talk about the coal production, to observe the case of the coal production is going to experience the most massive amount of increase as compared to what the plan had been. Because not all the countries have the presence of oil. Oil is costlier, coal is cheaper. So they find it cheaper to import coal, but rather they find it much more costlier to be oil dependent. Okay. Gas production is also set to increase substantially up till 2050. But by 2030, the massive jump that you will experience is that in coal production. Now, the difference or gap in production. Now, this data pointer, I want you to retain this data pointer. That is why I have written it in the PDF itself. This is vital for your prelims. You can have multi-statement question being framed from this particular topic. So, by 2030, governments now plan to produce over 120% more amount of fossil fuel than what would be consistent or what would be required as per 1.5 degrees Celsius level of warming. As compared to what? As compared to what they had submitted in 2023 report. And 77% more than what would be consistent with 2 degrees Celsius level of warming. And that is something we have seen in the case of coal, in the case of oil, and even in the case of gas production. Now, sector specific, coal is the most misaligned sector in terms of what the aims and ambitions are and what the reality is. Aims and ambitions were very high that we will cut down the coal production, we will cut down the coal utilization. But in reality, even in our country, when you take a look at the current affairs and in the newspaper headlines, when you follow the index of industrial production or IIP, you find that whenever the mining sector undergoes a contraction, the IIP reduces. And the government puts all the efforts to increase the coal output in order to improve the mining sector output, because that generates jobs as well and that gives you energy security as well. In 2030, the projected coal production is 500% higher than the level which is required for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So, when we talk about coal, 500% higher planned production. Higher planned production. Okay, that is the case of coal. When we talk about oil, basically 31% above the 1.5 degrees Celsius requirement by 2030. Gas, almost 92% higher than what is consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So just retain these particular facts. Coal, 500% higher, oil, 31%, and when we talk about gas, 92%. When compared to 2 degrees Celsius level of warming, then the coal is 30% higher, oil is 16% higher, and gas is 33% higher. Again, I will clarify if in case it is too much of data and you are getting confused by it. Please listen to this carefully. See, there is an estimated path of production if you want to limit the temperature by 2 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial era by 2100. And there is another planned limit of production if you want to limit the warming by 1.5 degrees. When you want to limit the warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius, then by 2030, what should be the overall production? The countries of the world, they are exceeding that by 500%. When you want to limit the warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius, then what should be the planned production by 2030? In case of oil, the various countries are exceeding it by 31%. And in the case of gas, the countries are exceeding it by 92%. But if you want to set the target at 2 degrees Celsius, then in the case of coal, the countries are exceeding it by 330% up till year 2030. They are exceeding it by 16% in terms of oil and by around 33% in the case of. Okay, so I hope that this is understood clearly. Now, here, when you compare it to the production gap report of 2023 with 2025, you'll find that China has got one of the larger amount of exceeding productions, right? Amongst the various different countries, China has got a larger amount of production gap. Then it is closely followed by India, right? Countries like United States, Germany, Russia, and the rest of the world, they have actually indicated a reduction in fossil fuel utilization as compared to what was their estimate. But developing nations and larger economies like China and India, they are going to use and they are going to consume so much amount of fossil fuels that overall, for the rest of the world, this is a net change of plus 7%. So that is basically the case of comparison in terms of coal production. Aligned means that you are basically going on the path of reducing. As per your plan, you are going on the path of reducing the fossil fuel usage. Misaligned means that this should be the pathway, you are taking another path. That is the difference. Okay. Now, misalignment with national climate pledges, what the various different countries had pledged. So, the planned production levels also exceed what would be implied by many governments' own climate mitigation plans. 11 countries plan higher production in 2030 as compared to what they did in 2023. So, whatever was their plan in 2023, by 2025, 11 countries are exceeding that production. Okay. And out of the 20 profiled countries, I will also tell you how the profiling of the countries is done with the help of the report itself. So, out of the 20 profiled countries, 17 of them they plan to increase the production by the year 2030. Now, profiling of the nations, not all the nations of the world were profiled out for this. So, the countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Germany, India, these were few of the countries which had been studied, where the policy has been studied. So, how do you profile or how do you make a profile for these countries? So, basically, you take a look at the government initiatives, you take a look at the overall energy production, the energy consumption, and thereafter, you basically generate a future perspective that if presently the government initiatives to combat climate change are such, then what the future. So that is basically the case of the profiling. This is the profile of India, as you can see. So updated climate ambitions of India, which is submitted as per India's nationally determined contribution for the Paris Agreement, the policy updates, right? So the national renewable plan that we have to increase the share of renewable in our energy mix to generate close to around 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. So all those are our policy, right? So updates to fossil fuel production plans and projections of the mining activities, production of the fossil fuel utilization activities, then updates on government support for domestic. So this is how you basically generate a profile. Now, if a statement is framed that in the production gap report, all the countries of the world have been profiled in order to generate the gap of production, the answer is no. Only few of the countries. Which are these countries? These are the countries where the profiling has been done. Okay. Now, that is the case of the coal, the oil, and the gas in terms of the gap, right? Implications. What are the implications of this production gap? First of all, stranded assets and infrastructure lock in. What do we mean by that? Stranded assets. For example, let's suppose you want to mine coal, you want to extract coal. You want to extract coal from a region like Odisha. Now, you will install the mining equipments, you will clear the forest, you will have the costly equipments, you will develop the entire infrastructure for mining, the supply chain network for mining. But then you do not expect as a country to be producing coal endlessly. Eventually, the coal production has to be stopped, isn't it? So the coal production has to be stopped. So what will you do with all the costly assets and infrastructure that you have built up? That will go to waste. That will be locked in. So that is basically when you increase the usage of fossil fuels now, there's a greater risk of the assets not being of great use after, let's suppose, a couple of decades. Economically, it will be punishing for the countries. Now, escalating the challenge for future reductions. That as I told you, as a candidate, you will find it incredibly difficult after a few months in order to increase the number of hours, right? It will almost be impossible. Similarly, for the countries also, for future transition, it becomes much more difficult. Then undermining the Paris Agreement goals, there will be greater level of warming as compared to what is the commitment of the Paris Agreement. Let us take a look at the question, multiple choice question. Let me know the answer. Which sector is cited as the most misaligned sector in the Production Gap Report 2025, with a projected production in 2030 being 500% higher than the level consistent with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway? This is a simple question, right? So in this case, the answer can be direct. It is C. That is coal, right? Coal showing the maximum amount of misalignment, 500%. When we talk about the 2 degrees Celsius warming, then coal represents around 300%, 330% level of misalignment. In the case of 1.5 degrees Celsius, coal represents 500% of misalignment. Okay? Now, which three organizations are specifically mentioned as being among the leading research institutes that released the Production Gap Report 2025? World Bank, IMF, and Climate Analytics, SEI Climate Analytics and IISD, IPCC, UNEP, and SEI, NTCA, MOEFCC, and IISD. Again, a simple question. Here, the correct answer is going to be B, that is SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, Climate Analytics, and International Institute of Sustainable Development. So this kind of questions you do find in the examination being very factual in nature, and that is where many of the candidates they panic. So all of that is accumulated from the portion of current affairs. Okay. Now, after that, the CMS report. Now, what is CMS, by the way? CMS basically is the Convention on Migratory Species, right? Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species. Now, this is basically also known by another name, that is Bonn Convention. Bonn Convention. Okay. When was it signed? This report was signed, or this convention rather, was signed in 1979. Came into force around 2 to 3 years later. Now, what is this report about? So you see, on frequent meetings of these various conventions, the different governments they present report about their own region, and various different leading and the kind of experts in environmental sector they present their own submission. So Indian experts have presented a report in the CMS that basically the Himalayan species, due to increased level of warming, they are getting threatened. How? Because when we talk about the Himalayan species, now if you consider the Himalayan ecosystem, so Himalayan ecosystem is quite diverse. If we talk about only the flora, so closer to the foothills, you find very dense forest, moist deciduous, in certain cases semi-evergreen or even evergreen. As you move higher up, you basically find the temperate evergreen, some of the temperate evergreen. You move higher up, you find the conifer, pines, cheer pines, and so on. You move higher up, no trees anymore, only the presence of grasses. You move higher up, no grasses even, and only the presence of snow. Now, if you consider species such as, let's suppose, musk deer, now Himalayan musk deer. Now, Himalayan musk deer is something that you will find in the lower heights, isn't it? You won't find the Himalayan musk deer at the top of Mount Everest. They can't tolerate that low temperature. So most of them will have been situated for a long period of time closer to the foothills. But due to rising temperature, the overall level of warming is happening to such an extent that most of these species they are driven uphill. As they are getting driven uphill, now their range, their habitat is reduced. That is why it is also referred to as the Great Climate Squeeze, where the existent areas where they can thrive, where they can survive, that area is reduced. Hence, the species are at a greater risk. So here, the Indian experts provided the example of pheasants, also the fish of snow trout. These were some of the examples which were provided. Okay. Humboldt enigma is very different, by the way. Now, here in the same meeting, you had the Sri Lankan expert. Sri Lankan expert basically talked about another finding. They talked about the case that due to climate change, due to global warming, the elephants they are finding better habitat in the region of Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, in the eastern part of Asia. So the Sri Lankan experts have said that the elephants have will be migrating to the east. Okay, all the elephants will be migrating to the east. But in various regions like India, in the regions like Sri Lanka, they don't have the option to cross the mountains or cross the seas to go to the eastern part of Asia. So that is why the elephants will also experience a shrinking of the space. So that is basically the highlight of the CMS report. Okay. Now, that is the case of it. So, a report by the United Nations Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals has raised the alarms over the impact of rising temperature on migratory species in the Himalayan and the northern portion of India. Now, a quick recap of what is the Bonn Convention or the CMS. So, the convention entered into force in 1983. It was signed when? It was signed in 1979. Okay. Now, objectives of the Bonn Convention: the adoption of strict protection measures for endangered migratory species. Please understand, when any species migrates from one region to another in order to find a better habitat, let's suppose a species like a sociable lapwing. Sociable lapwing is what? It is a kind of a bird, right? A migratory species of bird, which you will find in Central Asia. And this sociable lapwing, as per IUCN, is critically endangered. Okay. Now, this species of migratory bird in the winter season migrates from Central Asia into the wetlands of Western India. And then again in the summer season, it will move back to Central Asia. Now, let's suppose you are conserving and adopting greater degree of conservation of sociable lapwing in the region of Central Asia. Let's assume. Now, if the same species of sociable lapwing is hunted in India, will you be able to protect the species? No, their numbers will decline. Or let's suppose a country like Pakistan allows for hunting of this bird. Then again, their numbers will decline. That is why this convention was arrived at in 1979, that the species must be protected in their range home countries, in their destination region, as well as the range countries through which they end up migrating. So that is the purpose of EMS. Okay. Now, multilateral agreements for the conservation and the management of migratory species and cooperative research activities. For example, India and Bangladesh, in the last conference of parties for CMS, they agreed for the conservation of skimmers, a species of bird, in order to bring about a greater research and greater amount of conservation that both India as well as Bangladesh should carry out the protection of Indian skimmers. Now, the Bonn Convention, what it does, it basically divides the species into two appendices, Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Appendix 1 lists the migratory species that are classified as endangered with a high risk of extinction. Appendix 2 lists other species that would generally benefit from the international cooperation amongst the countries. Right? Now, the convention has legally binding agreements and MOUs which are tailored according to the various species and the requirement of all those species. Okay. Now, in India, you have some of the species under the Bonn Convention, some of the migratory species like the Amur falcons, again, a migratory species of bird, then bar headed geese, black necked cranes, marine turtles, including the leatherback turtles, dugongs, and humpback whales. These are some of the migratory species in India which are listed in the Bonn Convention. Okay. Benefit in terms of conservation of the species. That is where the benefit is actually deemed to be. Okay. Conservation of the species. Now, the study association. As a part of the national mission for sustaining the Himalayan ecosystem, the long term monitoring was initiated in 2015 across four major river basins of the Himalayan ecosystem. Which were the four major river basins of the Himalayan ecosystem? You basically had the Byas River Basin in Himachal Pradesh, Bhagirathi River Basin in the region of Uttarakhand, Tista in Sikkim, and Kameng in Arunachal Pradesh. These were the four river basins across which a periodic study had been carried out. Now, increasing temperatures are threatening the cold adapted species like musk deer, pheasants, and snow trout, forcing them to migrate to higher altitudes. And we know that, and we have talked about it, that when the species are forced to migrate to higher altitude, the space, the habitat, gets lesser. I hope there is no doubt in that. Because if you consider a mountainous ecosystem, earlier, let's assume the species were surviving in these areas. But now, due to climate change, the temperature in the foothill is rising. Temperature across the mountain is rising. So, whatever the temperature would be earlier in the lower region, now, in order to experience that temperature, the species have to move higher up. But they can't move very high up because, again, food availability will be minimal, temperature will be too cold. So, that is why the space shrinking. That is the level of migration, the level of shift. Small mammals in Uttarakhand showed the highest loss of the range. Okay, the smaller mammals. Then, in the case of large mammals, altitudinal shift to higher elevations, they have been predicted already, and that would be the squeeze for the musk deer and also for the case of the snow trout species, pheasants, snow trouts, etc. For majority of the species, the climate refuge due to migration, which is the region where they would prefer to live in, that would be close to around 1500 meters above the sea level. Now, pheasants, they exhibit high diversity in mid elevations with the eastern Himalaya showing high amount of endemism. What do we mean by endemism, by the way? Endemism refers to a particular kind of species to be found only in that region and nowhere else. That is the case of endemism. Migratory snow trout, okay, currently widespread in mid elevation rivers in the region around Jammu Kashmir as well, is predicted to lose a substantial portion of its range, again experiencing the high altitude. So these are the species. This is the snow trout and this is the Himalayan pheasant. Himalayan pheasant. Okay. Now this is greater in diversity in eastern Himalayas. Eastern, okay. And this is where you have a greater amount of habitat squeeze. The musk deer is also experiencing that kind of a habitat squeeze. Musk deer, mind you, it is the same species from where you have the critical oils which are extracted for perfumeries, for aromatic purposes, right? You have the musk kind of aroma which is used in perfume scents, etc. So, musk deer overall, if you take a look at it, IUCN has listed it as endangered. As per IUCN, it is endangered. In India, where do you find that? Basically, Himalayan range states of Jammu Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh. Other than that, is it only to be found in India? No. Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, China, the entire region here, the entire region, not in Bangladesh, obviously, not so much in Myanmar as well. The entire region of the subcontinent of the Himalayan region, you will find them to be present. They have a lifespan on an average of around 10 to 14 years. Okay. Now, here, basically, you will find they have a very short tail. Now, the male, they secrete waxy substance called musk from a gland in the abdomen. And they basically rub musk on the surfaces, various surfaces that they move through, in order to attract the females. Mostly active during the morning and the evening, early morning and evening. So it is not diurnal, it is not mostly nocturnal, it is crepuscular. The species which are active during the day, that is the diurnal species. The species which are active during the night, that is nocturnal. Species which are active in the evening and the part of the dawn, those are known as crepuscular species. So this is also one of those crepuscular species. Where are they found? Alpine forest above 2500-meter and their edges, the grasses along the edges. That is where you will find them. Right? Now they tend to communicate with the help of the defecation sites as well. And they use secretions from the caudal gland, which has got very strong aroma or a strong odor. Okay. Now, as I told you, the Sri Lankan experts, they also submitted the report about the shifting range of elephants. That climate and land use changes are pushing the habitats of the elephants eastwards. So limited migration routes to the east, they are causing human elephant conflict. And whenever any kind of man and animal conflict exists, the only winner is man. The wild animal or the wildlife is to lose out in the process, right? So that is why most of the wildlife, they die, right? So that is the case of the shifting range of elephants. This has been a report submitted by Sri Lanka. Report submitted by Sri Lanka. Okay. Due to increased urbanization, increased conversion of forest into agricultural pieces of land, the growth of invasive alien species. So that is why majority of the elephants, they find the agricultural crops as the only alternative food available. Now they cannot migrate to the west. Why? Why can't the elephants migrate to the west? Why are they only migrating to the east? Because in the west, there is desertified land. In the Indian subcontinent, if the elephants choose to migrate to the west, they find semi-arid and arid landscape with reduced amount of food availability. So that is why they cannot migrate to the west. They cannot migrate to the north because there is a mountainous barrier, the temperature barrier, terrain barrier. So that is why they tend to migrate to the east, geographically more conducive. But because there are mountainous barriers, sea barrier, hence the population experiences the man-animal conflict. Okay. Now, India has been a party to the Bonn Convention since which particular year? Take a look at the option. Let me know the answer. What is the correct answer of? India has been a party to the Bonn Convention since when? 1971, 1975, 1983, or 2000? So India has been a party to the Bonn Convention since 19. That is when the Bonn Convention came into existence. Okay. Now, Tigers Outside the Tiger Reserve Initiative. Now, what is this particular project about? So, for a long period of time, the government of India has been focusing upon increasing the tiger numbers in India. As a part of the St. Petersburg Declaration, which was signed way back in 2010, various different countries, they had agreed to increase the tiger population. India is amongst the only few countries which has actually managed to achieve that. Now, excuse me. Now, when we say India has managed to achieve that, so most of the tigers that you find presently are to be found in the region of tiger reserve. But obviously, with the increase in population, now tigers are solitary animals, right? So they like to have their own territory. So if the population increases, they want a larger territory. Or oftentimes the tigers will migrate from one area to another forested region. So if you have a tiger reserve here, you are conserving the tigers in this region. You have a tiger reserve here as well. But what about the tigers which are found in between? You need to conserve them as well. Just the same principle that we applied in the conservation of migratory species. So that is why this is the objective, Tiger Outside the Tiger Reserve Initiative, to conserve the tigers, which are not typically only restricted to the tiger reserve, but outside that limit as well. So during the Wildlife Week of 2025, that is when this initiative was launched. During the Wildlife Week of 2025, you had another few initiatives which were also launched. One of the initiative was Project Dolphin 2.0, right? That is to increase the conservation of dolphin population, riverine dolphin population, as well as the marine dolphin population in our country. Then, second was to improve the conservation and reintroduction of the gharial population. That was another initiative. So one was for the dolphins, riverine and marine. Second was for the gharial population. Third basically was the tiger conservation. And the fourth, that would basically be for the case of the sloth bear. In our country, you also have in the central and the southern part of the country in particular, you have large population of sloth bear. So conservation of sloth bear and project sloth bear. So these were the four initiatives which were launched in the Wildlife Week 2025. So Project Dolphin 2.0, Project Dolphin 2.0, then Harial conservation and reintroduction across the various different river systems, Harial conservation and reintroduction. Then, other than that, Tiger Outside the Tiger Reserve initiative. Then, other than that, Project Sloth Bear. We'll study about Project Sloth Bear separately. Okay. So these were the four initiatives and the species which were targeted for better conservation in the Wildlife Week of 2025. Now, which are the organizations which are responsible for the Tiger Outside the Tiger Reserve initiative? So that is the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MOEFCC. Other than that, NTCA. Any initiative of tiger conservation will have the involvement of the NTCA. NTCA, is it a statutory body or a non-statutory body? Always remember, NTCA is a statutory body. It has been given the legal backing with the help of the amendment to the Wildlife Act, which was done in 2005. So after that, NTCA was provided with greater amount of teeth, and that is when 2006, and that is when basically NTCA became a statutory organization. Okay. Project will be implemented over a 3-year plan period from 2025 to 2028. Total outlay of 88 crores almost will be executed by the state forest departments. The aim is to reduce the human tiger conflict in the non reserve landscape. In tiger reserve, NTCA has formulated already various different policies for conservation. In the tiger reserve, you have the core area, you have the buffer zone. So automatically there is a lot of restriction. But what about the tigers outside that? So in those areas, man animal conflict should not happen, right? To protect tigers that move beyond the reserve boundaries due to habitat fragmentation, growing population, and shrinking tiger corridors. Okay? Now, then to foster a landscape level conservation approach. What is landscape level conservation? Landscape level conservation indicates the presence of a substantial amount of tiger population with an able ecosystem, with an ideal habitat, and the presence of the prey species in that region as well. So that is landscape. Rather than simply taking a look at the tiger numbers, you take a look at the vegetation of that region, you take a look at the prey population, the deer population, and so on, the herbivore population, everything you plan into consideration and then you conserve that. That is the landscape level conservation. Now, it will encompass 80 forest divisions in 17 tiger range states, including MP, Karnataka, Maharashtra, wherever the tiger population is higher. Okay. Karnataka, Uttarakhand, Assam, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and Arunachal Pradesh. In whichever region the tiger population is higher, in those areas. Focuses on the buffer and corridor areas adjoining the high density tiger reserve with the help of AI based tool, GPS based tracking. That is how conservation shall be done. Formation of rapid response teams. And one thing that is another factor important for your prelims, launch of Bagh Mitra, right? Bagh Mitra is an awareness kind of a program, outreach program, and jungle camps for students in order to promote the coexistence, in order to raise awareness for conservation. So that is the case of Bagh Mitra. Okay. NTCA will obviously take a look at the implementation, and the funds will be managed by the chief wildlife wardens of the state and the Campa authorities which are present in the state. Now, coming to another report, and that is the State of Finance for Forest Report 2020. Now, this is the first of a kind report which is generated. What is this report? What is the importance of this report? And what should you focus upon? So, first of all, forests. Across the world, you need larger amount of forest in order to limit the level of warming as well, in order to conserve the biodiversity, isn't it? Because whenever you talk about a forested region, whenever you talk about a forested area, now forests, they store and capture carbon dioxide, CO2. So when they capture CO2, they will limit the level of warming, isn't it? When they limit the level of warming, that means what? Help in meeting the climate goals, help in meeting climate goals, right? Then, other than that, forests, they also serve as natural habitat for the for biodiversity, isn't it? Now, when they help in becoming the natural habitat for biodiversity, it will help in meeting goals of goals of Convention on Biological Diversity or Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this Global Biodiversity Framework was provided by whom or when? It was provided as a part of Conference of Parties to CBD, where you had the Kunming Montreal Agreement. Agreement. Okay. So that is where the forest, if you have increased amount of forest, it will help you meet the goals of climate as well, of biodiversity. So that is why forests are must. But then when we talk about these forests, the upkeep of the forest, the prevention of degradation, deforestation of the forest, that also requires funding, greater amount of funding, isn't it? Now, when you require greater amount of funding, not all the countries have that. In the tropics, the requirement of forest is much higher because the temperature is much higher, so you need greater level of cooling. So Which country has got more amount of funding, which country receives greater amount of donations, which regions or institutes or countries provide greater amount of donations to other countries. That is what the state of finance for forest report talks about. It also talks about the case of the funding gap. Funding gap. Okay. That what is the required amount of money which is to be given for upkeep of the forest in an area, and what is the available amount of funding. So the funding gap is immense. So they track it as per the 2023 data report based on based upon 2023. Okay. Now India as a country receives largest amount of funding from the foreign donors for the forests. But then in India, the funding is mostly directed to agroforestry, not for maintenance of degraded forest, mostly for agroforestry, silvopasture, or the case of silvoforestry. What do we mean by that agroforestry? That let's suppose you have a case of a farmland where you are growing crops. Now, in between them, you basically are growing the tree, right? So that is increasing the tree cover, increasing the forest cover along with the agricultural area. So in India, almost entirety of the forest funds that is basically used in this agroforestry. This is something we have seen in the case of the state of forest report, which was generated last year in the month of December, where we observed a substantial increase in forest cover, particularly in the areas like Maharashtra, right? So that is where in India, majority of the funding. So what is the outcome or what is the finding of the report? The finance gap in terms of what is required and what is available, the countries, the region specific financing when it comes to. Okay. Now, then the first state of finance for forest report published by the UNEP in 2025 is the first edition of such kind of a report. Now, UNEP, by the way, UNEP is an important environmental organization which was founded on the eve of the Stockholm Conference 1972. 1972 Stockholm, Stockholm Conference. Okay. That is basically when UNEP was founded. UNEP is also instrumental in the formation of IPCC and various other reports globally that you come across. That is where UNEP is very, very vital and very instrumental as well. So the report provides an overview of the global finance, that is the public finance as well as the private finance. Now, please understand, as long as you are reliant on public finance, what do we mean by public finance? Public finance basically tells you the financing provided by the government. And then you have the private finance, which is provided by corporations, the larger organizations, NGOs, and so on. Now, which is better, public or private? Always it is better to have the support from private finance. Why? Because let's suppose you have the government which is financing all of these. Now, tomorrow, or let's suppose in a shorter period of time, let's assume that a country is going through hardships, economic recession, or let's suppose the event of a war. Now, the government which was providing money for the forest, in the event of the war, do you think the government will still keep on continuing to provide the money for the forests? No, that money will be diverted. Or let's suppose the government tomorrow feels the need to expand the infrastructure. Now, will they continue to pump in money in the case of the forest thereafter? No, they will divert it for infrastructure. So that is where there is a greater amount of uncertainty. But when you have a kind of commitment provided by or a streamlined supply of the private finance. It is much more long lasting, and there is the ability of the government to do multiple other activities of conservation as well. The government's hands are not tied. That is why always advisable to galvanize greater amount of private finance. But presently, the state of finance for forest report indicates that majority, around 90% of the funding across the world is done by the government sector. Very little amount of funding is actually done by the private agent. Most of the funding is done by the government sector alone. Now, it is found that the annual global investment in forests needs to triple to around $300 billion by 2030. Presently, it is close to around $86 billion. So that needs to, or $84 billion, and that needs to almost triple, right? Because the amount of money required for the conservation and expansion of the forest by 2030 is going to be $300 billion. Okay. Now, then, report highlights that the current investment is dominated by the public sources, around 91%, and there's a funding gap of $216 billion, which exists annually. So, what is measured when we say forest finance? What do we measure in the case of forest finance? So, as per the Forest Declaration Assessment, forest or the green finance is the finance which is provided by the public or the private sector in order to increase the conservation of the forest as per the red plus finances, conservation of the local population, indigenous communities, and their empowerment as well. Now, when we say empowerment of the local community, how does it protect the forest? Understand this. Whenever and in whichever country you talk about the indigenous population and the local communities, most of them would be forest dwellers, the indigenous community, most of them, the tribals, for example, majority of them would be forest dwellers. Now the tribals, what do they want? They don't want the multiplexes in those areas. They want the forest to be left alone. So, if you are investing in the conservation of the tribal population, if you are investing in the indigenous communities, indirectly you are also conserving the forest. The report has highlighted that the money which is being spent on the individual or indigenous communities and the local population, that is very less, around 30%. Right. So that amount of money also needs to be increased. And then what is this concept of red plus? So when we say red plus is basically reduction of emission from degradation and deforestation of the forest. That is red plus. Now, red plus was is an initiative which was arrived at in Conference of Parties number 19 in Warsaw, Poland. Okay. What is this concept of red plus? And this was asked in the UPSC prelims examination earlier as well. So please understand, whenever you consider a tree, right? Now, a tree naturally ends up being a sink of carbon dioxide. It stores carbon dioxide, isn't it? So, why does it store carbon dioxide? The trees, they generally take in CO2 in order to carry out the process of photosynthesis, where they convert that CO2 into carbohydrates and they produce oxygen as a byproduct. But the same tree, if you cut it down, let's suppose you have cut down the tree, then what? Will it continue to absorb carbon dioxide further? All the stored carbon which is there in the tree in the form of the tissues where you have the carbon compounds being transferred in the form of or in the tissues of xylem and phloem, all those carbon compounds will be released in the form of gases like methane. So, due to deforestation, the trees become the emission sources of trees become emission sources for CO2 rather than being the sinks, the sinks of CO2. So that is why deforestation is amongst the larger anthropogenic sources of carbon dioxide emission and methane emission. Okay. So most of the anthropogenic aspects like fossil fuel, burning of fossil fuel, combustion, etc., they also release carbon dioxide equivalent and carbon dioxide. But deforestation is also one of those. And even degradation of the forest, where the density reduces and so on. So that also makes the overall forest a net emitter rather than a net. So if you want to meet the climate goals, you want to reduce the level of warming, you have to reduce these kind of emissions, isn't it? That is where the concept of reduction of emission from degradation and deforestation, that was started. And this stands for red. Okay, this stands for red. Now, having said that, once this was initiated, it did not pick up across the globe. Many of the countries did not follow it, right? They did not see any incentive about it. That why should I care about conserving or reducing the amount of degradation of the forest? That is when you had developing nations like India. These developing nations, they pitched forward and advocated an idea that we go for financial incentives. Financial incentives to be provided to the local indigenous population, the forest dweller, so that they become a stakeholder in the conservation process. Once they become a stakeholder in conservation, they will be able to protect the trees in a much better manner, isn't it? The outsiders will never be able to protect the forest as well as the local community. You would have seen that in various social situations as well, various popular culture as well, that it is always the local community which is a better conservator of the forest. So that is where they came across the Red Plus program. Red Plus was to financially incentivize the local community and the indigenous population, and to bring about the incentive for the country also to reduce the level of deforestation. In a way, this would reduce the poverty levels as well. So, this is where, when you have a multiple choice question which talks about, and this was the previous year question, that what are the outcomes of Red Plus? First of all, conservation of forest, conservation of biodiversity, reduction of poverty. Which of these are the outcomes of Red Plus? Majority of the candidates will think that it is only about the conservation of forest, only about the conservation of biodiversity. But no, when you provide financial incentive, that is when it will reduce poverty as well. So all three of them are the designated outcomes of Red Plus. So that is the Red Plus. Okay. So there also financing is provided by the various different countries, and that is also considered to be a kind of a forest finance. So financing provided as per the Red Plus, that is also considered to be a part of the forest finance. Okay. Now, what are the outcomes and the findings of this state of finance for forest report? First of all, $84 billion were channeled into forest and the forest finances in 2020. What is the requirement? $300 billion. And what was provided? $84 billion. So, what is the finance gap? Around $216 billion. Okay. Now, $362 million was provided in financing for the indigenous population and the local community, which is close to around only 30% of the requirement. Then less than one in every $10 comes from the private invest. Most of the money is coming from the public sector investment. And the forest cover needs to be expanded by another 1 billion hectares. Okay. The forest cover needs to be expanded by 1 billion hectares in order to meet the climate ambition and the climate goals. 30% of the Earth's land is covered by forests, right? And we lose about 10 million hectares every year. Deforestation. Now, deforestation majorly happens why? Expansion of agricultural cultivation or extension of agriculture. Extension of agriculture is one of the major reasons of deforestation, particularly in countries like Malaysia, in countries like Indonesia. You will find that extension of agriculture, of palm oil cultivation in particular, that tends to provide a greater incentive to the farmers to cut down the tropical rain. Otherwise, the infrastructure building activities and so on, they also continue, right? So 2023, $84 billion is provided. By 2030, the need is $300 billion. By 2050, the need is basically $498 billion. That is the requirement of funding. Almost $500 billion is the requirement of funding to be provided by around 20. Now, this is an interesting chart if you take a look at it and if you study it carefully. This is basically about the various countries having the finance. Now, if you take a look at the various countries, now public, obviously the public spending, that means the government of those countries are spending. The maximum spending is done by China, right? Followed by US, followed by India, then followed by Japan. Now, India stands number 3 when it comes to the public financing. That is what is the government. But the interesting part here is look at the funding provided in India. Now, in India, you will observe that almost all the funding is for agriculture and forest, agroforest, almost, right? The funding is not directed towards environmental protection, protection of biodiversity and landscape, or even for research and development for environmental protection. Whereas take a look at China. China spends considerable amount of money when it comes to environmental protection, when it comes to conservation of landscape. Agroforestry, India stands number 2 in terms of the overall spending. Because if you take a look at it, basically, when you take a look at China, China is the largest spender in agroforestry. Then comes India, then comes you. So this is the public spending. Okay. So that is the case of the public spending. This is different from the donations which are coming in. This is different from the outside funding which is coming in. So approximately 41% of the tracked government spending on forest is happening in China, the US. There also, agricultural and the forestry sector is the only one which is being prioritized. Okay. In 2023, of the total $75 billion in domestic government expenditure, right, greater amount of money was allocated in the tropical forested region. All this is the text and the data pointer that you can take a look into. Now, public domestic expenditure on forest in the tropical countries. You don't consider China, US in the portion of the tropical countries. So, amongst the tropical countries, if you generate a chart, amongst the tropical countries, maximum expenditure by, okay, close to around $7 billion. That is what India provides, right? How much is China being able to provide? China is providing around 19 billion. US is providing 12 billion. And India is providing around 7.1 billion. Then followed by Brazil. But observe, Brazil is spending some amount of money in landscape development, in R&D purposes and other purposes as well. But in India, almost all the money is spent in agriculture and in, okay. Now, financing inflows. So, Africa is the largest recipient of international forest finance, right? Africa, when it comes to it, largest recipient of forest finance, followed by Latin America and Caribbean. right? Then you have countries like Asia. So that is the case of the financing which is provided. Amongst the financing which is provided, Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC also receives a substantial amount of amongst the outside funding which is provided. So DRC, then followed by Peru, Brazil, Indonesia, Argentina, India. So India in this case stands at number 6 in terms of the inflows of funds. Indigenous population and local community, they get around 36% of the, or they basically protect around 36% of the global forest, but out of large amount of funds, get a meager proportion of only $360 billion. Now, this is the region wise classification that you can take a look into in terms of the money which is provided. So basically, over 33% is allocated for cross regional initiatives. Now, when we talk about the type of funding, which kind of funding is provided for the conservation of forest? So you have concessional funding, that is in the form of grants, where as a recipient you are not expected to pay back interest, right? And then you have non-concessional, that is, you will have to pay the interest rate as well. So majority of the funding is concessional, non-concessional, okay? Always for environmental purposes. What is desirable? For environmental purposes, it is always desirable to have concessional finance. For example, imagine that you are a part of a poor family household. Now, I give you a loan of 10 lakhs or a grant of 10 lakhs that you go and build a house for yourself. And I don't expect that 10 lakh in return. Only then will your life get better, isn't it? But imagine that I give you 10 lakh and I charge you 10% interest. Now, you will be able to build a house, but you will be spending so much amount of money in repaying the interest that you will continue to remain poor. Your situation will never improve. So that is the difference between concessional and non-concessional funding. When it comes to the poorer countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, they always require a kind of concessional finance, because that is when the concessional finance will help them overcome the environmental challenges without putting their finances at. Now, which are the donors amongst the donor countries? Germany and UK are the largest donors amongst the countries, right? Together, they provide almost half of the public international forest finance, Germany and UK. Amongst the multilateral institutes, you have International Development Association that provides 65% of the total funding. That is followed by IBRD and the European Union Institute. GCF and GEF, they also produce or provide minuscule amount of funding. This share has to increase. That is what the underdeveloped and the developing countries have been demanding for a long period of time. GEF, mind you, is also an outcome of the same Rio summit where you had the CBD, UNFCCC, and the Convention to Combat Desertification that was signed. So their share for funding for the finance for the forest, that is very restricted. Okay. So here, Germany and UK, this is something relevant for your prelims. Okay. Germany and UK, they are amongst the largest donors. And amongst the multilateral institutes, you have IBRD or IDA rather, International Development Association, right? Followed by IBRD. Okay. Then India, India was amongst the top 15 recipients of public international finance. And despite the overall international forest finance, India's expenditure is around $7.1 billion. Now, India ranked third, following China and US. And India's public domestic spending is mostly in agriculture and the forestry sector. Now, the report also highlights that majority of the forest finance which is provided, or rather, the funding which is provided by the governments, Now, that funding by the government is misplaced. For example, as a country, think about India itself. The amount of finance that we provide to agricultural sector, the amount of support, subsidies that we provide to agricultural huge, is very large, isn't it? Now, that agricultural support that you are providing, so basically, what will be the outcome of it? Now, in majority of the cases, the agriculture tends to damage the forest system. They tend to carry out deforestation for the extension of agriculture, isn't it? So, we are providing greater amount of finances, public finances and subsidy to those sectors which are damaging the forest. Rather than that, the report highlights that we should divert the amount of funding into those direct sources of providing finances to the forest. Okay, so that is the case of that potentially harmful finances that outweigh the finances provided for forest. Okay, so $406 billion annually for harmful subsidies in agriculture per year, and only $84 billion for forest. So that can obviously be balanced a bit. Now, the way forward, tropical forest countries will require an estimated $67 billion annually, which is allocated to avoid deforestation, for reforestation and afforestation program, protected forest area, agroforestry, silvo-arable and silvopastoral. Silvo-arable and silvopastoral simply means the kind of agroforestry. In the agricultural land, you have the forest ecosystem, and avoided forest peatland conversion. Okay, so that is where the funding is required. So, this is the case of the State of Finance for Forest Report 2025, generated by UNEP. To summarize it, what does it highlight? Majority of the funding is by the public sources. Majority of the funding is for agriculture and forestry. Private finances need to be galvanized. There is a large funding gap and the finance gap, which is available. Okay. Now, then we come to another report which highlights that Asia's carbon capture push may jeopardize global climate goals. So that brings us to the topic of carbon capture, usage, and storage. What is the meaning of this? So, for example, when we talk about limiting the level of global warming, one of the important aspects of that is reducing the level of greenhouse gases, isn't it? One of the most potent greenhouse gases is CO2. That is considered to be one of the most potent CO2 or greenhouse gases. So, CO2 in the air is increasing the level of warming, increases the level of warming, right? Now, when we say this CO2 increases the level of warming, if we want to cool the planet, we need to capture the CO2, capture CO2, then maybe transport it somewhere, transport it, and then store it, store CO2. Where do you store it? Deep underground. That is where you can store it, underground, or maybe in the case of depleted oil reserves or depleted coal mines in order to improve the level of extraction of oil in those oil reserves. So depleted oil reserves, oil reserves. Okay. So depleted oil reserves or deep underground, that is where you will store CO2. So this is basically carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CC. This year in the mains examination, you had a direct question being asked about CCUS. Now, how do you carry out the carbon capture? You basically carry out carbon capture by four different mechanisms, four different methodologies are used, right? Now, in each of these methodologies, either you take the fossil fuel, right? Prior to combustion, prior to combustion, you separate the carbon dioxide, separate CO2. So that is how you don't allow the CO2 to get burnt itself. So you are capturing carbon. Then, other than that, you basically capture carbon from the points of emission, from the chimneys of the power plants, of the industries. There you put certain filters, certain absorbents, and that will, in a way, remove the carbon. So, from the sources of emission, from the sources of emission, right? That is one of the methodologies of carbon capture. Another methodology of carbon capture is basically where you carry out a complete combustion of fossil fuel, right? You burn the fossil fuel in large amount of oxygen, so that complete burning will happen. No carbon monoxide, etc. will. And then you have the direct carbon, direct air capture, direct air capture. That is from the ambient air, from your surrounding air. Just like you have air purifiers, imagine you have devices which take in carbon dioxide. So direct air capture will allow you to basically remove the historical carbon dioxide emissions from the air as well. So all these are various ways in which you can capture CO2. Now apply your logic here. Now whenever you use any of these methodologies to capture carbon, they will require energy. If you want to separate CO2 from the fossil fuel, it will require some amount of energy. If you want the chimneys and the filters to capture carbon, that would also require energy. Then, if you want direct air capture, for that machinery to operate, also you require energy. So, all of this requires energy, isn't it? Now, where do you get this energy from? The energy is provided by combustion of fossil fuels, combustion of fossil fuels in the power plants, coal power plants, etc. Fossil fuels. Now, when energy is provided by the combustion of fossil fuel, or energy is, let's suppose, uh, taken in for the from the combustion of fossil fuels, this will generate more carbon, more CO2, which will provide more warming, isn't it? So the outcome of it is that in order to remove CO2 from the air, we are releasing more CO2 indirectly based upon the technology that we have, based upon the technology that the countries are using. They are actually burning more amount of fossil fuels in order to capture the carbon. And also, many of the countries which are actually involved in this carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Asia, they are partnering with companies like ExxonMobil and Shell. And what they are doing is they are channelizing that carbon dioxide in depleted oil reserves to improve the extraction. Improve extraction of CO2, or extraction of oil. So, oil usage will increase. Oil usage, when it increases, again, what will it lead to? It will generate more carbon dioxide, which will further lead to more warming. So that is what the report highlights, that the strategy which is being followed by majority of the countries, Asian countries, for carbon capture, that is going to lead to greater amount of warming rather than providing any amount of cooling. Yes, oceans also absorb CO2. Correct, Chirag. So that is the finding of the report. That is why the report highlights that if actually the countries of the world they want to provide cooling, they want to reduce the level of warming rather than going for carbon capture methodology which has limited output to be shown, they should actually transition to renewable form of energy. That will be much more helpful rather than installing all these costly devices. Okay. Now, a report by Climate Analytics has warned that Asia's expansive plans for carbon capture and storage could lead to nearly 25 billion tons of additional greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, threatening the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius climate target. Now, the report has been titled Global Climate Risk of Asia's Expansive Carbon Capture and Storage Plans. This is a study which is done across nine of the major Asian countries, that is China, India, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, and Australia. In all these, India does not have any plans, active plan for carbon capture. We still don't have. The government is in the works of that, but till now we don't have an official carbon capture plan. Singapore is turning out to be a hub. Majority of the Southeast Asian nations are turning out for carbon capture for better oil extraction. Now, this is the CCUS process. First of all, capture from the power plant, from the steel plant, from the cement plants, capture the carbon, transport it via pipelines or ships. You similarly have a same kind of project being run in the Scandinavian region, that is in the region of North Sea. If you know the name, that is the Northern Lights Project. Northern Lights Project. Okay. That is basically being carried out in the region of Oigerden, Norway, right? For carbon storage. Okay. So this is a global program. This was asked in UPSC again in the GS portion as well as in the case of the prelims portion. It has been asked. Okay. Just a moment. Right. So in all these portions, it has actually been. So that is why the CCUS becomes important for your examination. So coming back to it. So basically, that is the case of carbon storage. So we have discussed there are four different methods of carbon capture. Four different ways. Pre-combustion, pre-combustion, post-combustion, post-combustion, right? Then you have burning combustion in excess oxygen in order to carry out complete burning, and then direct air capture. Air capture. These are the four carbon capture methodology. What is pre-combustion? So removes carbon dioxide before the fossil fuels are burnt. So fossil fuel undergoes gasification process, which turns it into a mixture of hydrogen and CO2. Fossil fuels generally have carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates. So when you carry out the gasification process, so understand gasification process is also energy intensive. You require a lot of energy to turn any kind of fossil fuel into a kind of a perfect gas. Now the hydrogen can be burnt as a clean fuel because when you burn hydrogen, it produces water vapor, right? So that is not a pollutant. And in the case of CO2, that can be transported thereafter. Since the CO2 produced in pre-combustion is higher in concentration, CO2 removal is much easier and cleaner as well. Then post-combustion, most widely used across industries like power plants, steel sector, cement sector, etc. Specially designed filters, absorbents are used for capturing the carbon. Then you have direct air capture, which absorbs carbon dioxide from the surrounding air, not necessarily restricted to the sources of emission. That is why direct air capture allows you to remove the historic carbon dioxide load as well. So, here, CO2 emitted in the past can also be. This would allow more CO2 to be removed from the atmosphere. So, in general, it can be more effective, but obviously, we don't have the technology till now. And then you have oxy-fuel combustion, burns fuel in pure oxygen, producing CO2 and steam, which can then be easily captured. So, these are the different methodologies. Now, the challenges. So, CCS, carbon capture and storage, has consistently been underperformed. Capture rates hover close to around 50%, right? And what is the target and what is the scientific target for carbon capture? Close to around 95%. But we are underperforming. 80% of the current CCS projects, they use the carbon dioxide which is captured to enhance the oil recovery in the depleted oil reserve. So that will again lead to greater carbon dioxide emission and greater level of warming. Most CCS projects in Asia target sectors where the emission can be reduced. For example, let's suppose steel sector. Now you can, or hydrogen, we can go for green hydrogen, we can go for green ammonia, we can go for green steel. Now that will reduce the level of emission. Rather than capturing carbon, why not change the technology? If there is technology to ideally remove the level of emissions, better to do that than to install these carbon capture methodologies. Now, governments in Japan, South Korea, and Australia are amongst those which have an active CCS strategy, right? Southeast Asian nations, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, they are positioning themselves as CO2 storage hubs. How? In partnership with oil and gas recovery companies so that they can exploit more amount of oil and natural gas. Singapore is developing a regional CCS hub with ExxonMobil and Shell. Think about it. It is the example that I oftentimes give. So, carbon capture is being initiated by ExxonMobil and Shell, the polluting companies. So, imagine always take the case of the brand like ITC. ITC manufactures cigarettes, right? ITC also manufactures the nicotine gums, the de addiction gum. So if you want to get addicted to cigarettes, you go to ITC. If you want to get de-addicted, you go to ITC. So the same is the case with ExxonMobil and Shell. So that is how they are storing that CO2 in order to extract greater amount of oil. So that is the kind of greenwashing that these companies have been doing in partnership with the countries, right? Now, India specific, India's CCS strategy, carbon capture storage strategy is almost negligible. Almost negligible. We don't have any substantial government strategy or the long term strategy in order to basically carry out the carbon capture. And it is disconnected from the East Asian Australian linkage for carbon capture network. That is the Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, Australia network for carbon capture. We are disconnected from that. Having said that, India is a very important country when it comes to carbon capture and storage because we are amongst the larger producers of steel, cement, construction sector is on the boom. So we are producing larger amounts of the carbon intensive output. Production of steel requires large amount of carbon emission. Production of cement, fertilizers, aluminium, all of that has got large amount of carbon emission, right? So rather than implementing this strategy of carbon capture and storage, we should go for renewables, renewable sources of energy that will be much more beneficial in the long run. Okay. Now, findings, the report identifies two major risks: an underperforming ICCS pathway where carbon capture storage is deployed but fails to meet expected capture rate, and underachieved where CCS is promoted but not realized, diverting resources from proven zero emission technology. Okay, these are the two major risks. What is the way forward? switch to renewables, to renewables. Okay. Then move to or reduce carbon intensity in the GDP, carbon intensity in the GDP by going for green steel, by adopting green steel, green hydrogen, etc. Okay, right? Then increase the R&D for direct air capture, air capture. Okay, then targeted carbon sequestration by each of the industries as well. Targeted carbon sequestration or storage by planting more trees, afforestation, and so on. So all that, basically, that is the way forward. Okay, so that is the kind of strategy which should be followed going in the future. Green finance is also one of those. Then why has IUCN red flagged the Western Ghats? Now, IUCN is an international organization, non-governmental organization, which basically carries out the detailed study for the climate activities or habitat, the wildlife, and so. Okay. But switching to renewable one emits some amount of carbon. Not necessary. Not the same amount of carbon as compared to, let's suppose you are switching to solar power. Yes, the industry producing solar panel, they will be producing some amount of carbon dioxide, but not as much as, let's suppose, a coal thermal power plant, right? So that is why the overall emission will always reduce, right? So that is the now IUCN, as I was telling you, International Union for Conservation of Nature, that was founded in 1948. Now, it carries out study for the various species of plants, animals, microbes, organisms, and gauges an idea for conservation status. It brought about the Red Book in 1964, which basically talked about the threatened status, critically endangered status, vulnerable status of the various different species. Now, IUCN, what it has done, it has studied the various habitats across the world. Now, while studying the various habitats across the world, it has found some of them are safe, some of them are in a good state condition, some of them are good but are critical as well. So, accordingly, it has flagged the region of Western Ghats, which is prone to infrastructure like dam building for road construction that is being done in the Western Ghats of India, tourism. Now, because of that, the local biodiversity in the Western Ghats that is getting endangered. That is why it has flagged Western. So the expansive Western Ghats and two national parks in India, that is Manas in Assam and Sundarbans in West Bengal, they have been categorized of significant concern. Right? Now, IUCN's list of natural World Heritage sites across Asia, in that study, they have been identified as significant concern. Broadly, IUCN has categorized the various different protected areas or natural heritage sites into different categories, four categories. So they are categorized as good, good with some concerns, significant concern, and critical. These are the four different classification done for the case of natural habitat. Okay, four different kind of classification which is done. Now, Western Ghats, Manas, and Sundarbans, they are flagged amongst the portions of significant concern. Kanchenjunga, that is in the region of Sikkim. Kanchenjunga is categorized as good. Okay, so that is the case of Kanchenjunga. But Western Ghats, then you basically have the case of Manas and Sundarbans, that is significant concern. For Western Ghats, a dedicated commission was established. See, if you are talking about Kasturi Rangan Commission, this was just one of the committees. There are multiple committees and commissions which have been established for the conservation of Western Ghats. Right. There have been various commissions associated with the prevention of mining activities, prevention of eco-sensitive zone, protection of eco-sensitive zones in the region of Western Ghats. Kasturi Rangan, the students, they mostly associate with the Kasturi Rangan Commission because it was asked in the previous year question, right? But other than that, also, there are multiple such commissions which are formed time and time again to understand the eco-sensitive nature of the region of Western Ghats. Okay. Now, of the 228 sites assessed since 2014, 63% sites had a positive outlook in 2014. Then overall, you basically had the IUCN shows, the report shows that only 57% of these sites they have a positive outlook now as compared to 2014, 17 and 20. This is the fourth report which is generated. First in 2014, then in 2017, then in 2020 and now in 2025. So the various different protected areas with better amount of conservation or good outlook that has reduced. Okay. Now, the threats, climate change, right? Now, the natural habitats or the natural heritage sites facing the threat of climate change that has increased from 33% to around 43%. Infrastructure development, road, tourism, dams in the case of Western Ghats, invasive alien species that is also impacting the natural habitat and fragmentation of habitat due to changing land use pattern, extension of agriculture. All these are varying different threats that the natural habitats face. Other than that, forest fires, particularly in the region around Uttarakhand, right? Himachal Pradesh, hunting, roadkill, waste disposal, encroachment, illegal logging, construction, all these are the threats faced. Now, of the 32 Asian sites categorized as good with some concerns, four happen to be in India. Western Ghats, Manas, and Sundarbans, significant concern. Good, Kanchenjunga. Good with some concern, that is the Great Himalayan National Park Conservation Area, Kaziranga National Park, Dev National Park, and the Nanda Devi, the Valley of Flowers. So these are good with some, okay, good with some concern. Kanchenjunga, okay. Now, then it is Western Ghats basically is a globally recognized biodiversity hotspot as well. In India, you have four biodiversity hotspots. Himalayan biodiversity hotspot, the uh, eastern part, that is Indo-Burma biodiversity hotspot. Then you have the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka biodiversity hotspot, and then the region of Great Nicobar, which is included in the Sundaland biodiversity hotspot. So Western Ghats, they have very unique kind of birds, plants, and animals which are unique to only Western Ghats. They are endemic to Western Ghats itself, right? And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that is why it requires greater amount of conservation to be carried out. A gap in quantified data basically is a major lacuna in terms of the impact of invasive alien species and what is their proportion, what is their spread. We don't have enough study done. That is the worry. Now, coming to the next topic, synchronous All India Elephant Estimation 2021 to 2025 has been carried out. Now, this is done in a very scientific method along with the AI based mapping and along with the DNA records as well. So, there, the findings have indicated that elephant, the state with the maximum population of elephant is Karnataka, and which are the other areas. So, that was released by the Ministry of the Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MOEFCC, and Wildlife Institute of India. It has reported 22,500 elephants in the country, primarily concentrated in the region of Western Ghats. Right? Western Ghats is where majority of the population is present. Now, Asian elephants, majority of the Asian elephants are to be found in India. Now, Asian elephants, what is their IUCN status? It is endangered. Since 1986, it has been listed as endangered. As per official data, India accounts for the largest population, over 60%. Okay. Elephant census is carried out every 5 years since 1992. 1992, why? 1992 was the launch of Project Elephant. Project Elephant. Right. That was the year for the launch. Project Tiger, 1973. Project Rhino, 2005. So these are some of the important conservation programs which have been launched. Now, this is the overall representation of the elephant population that you will find in India. You will find greater amount of density in the region of Nilgiris, the region of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. That is where you will find a greater population. Other than that, the region of Uttarakhand and northern portion of the Terai belt of UP and some portion in Assam. These are the areas where elephant population is substantial. Western Ghats, close to around 12,000 elephants. Other habitat, Eastern Hills and Brahmaputra floodplains, 6,500 elephants, followed by Shivalik and the Gangetic, 2,000 elephants. Central India and Eastern Ghats, 1890. Okay, so largest proportion in the region of Western Ghats, to be followed by Eastern Hills and Brahmaputra Delta, to be followed by the Shivaliks and the Gangetic Plain, to be followed by Central India and Eastern Ghats. Okay, so that is the distribution of the elephant population. Karnataka, largest proportion of elephants, followed by Assam, followed by Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Uttarakhand. Now, in Karnataka, the region around the Brahmagiri Hills, mind you, Brahmagiri Hills, the region of the substantial dense forest vegetation, where you also have the origin of the river of Kaveri. So, Brahmagiri, Nilgiri, Eastern Ghats, that entire forest corridor, that is where the elephant population is very high. So, home to the largest subpopulation in Western Ghats. It has multiple different elephant reserves, some of the largest, like the Mysuru Elephant Reserve, Nilgiri Elephant Reserve, Wayanad Elephant Reserve, Nilambur Elephant Reserve, and the Coimbatore Elephant Reserve. All of these are situated in the region around Karnataka, the southern vicinity of the state. Now, challenges. Now, the population of the elephants compared to 2017 has dipped by nearly 18%. The government is saying that the past data was unreliable. Past data was not carried out by scientific methodology, so they are considering this new data as the baseline from where the study of the population of elephants will be carried out. Jharkhand and Odisha, they have seen a 68% and a 58% drop in the population of elephants. Chhattisgarh, however, has seen a rise in elephant population by almost 82%. Why? Because the population of elephants which have declined, which have moved out from Jharkhand and Odisha, they have migrated into the neighboring state of Chhattisgarh. In the region of Jharkhand and Odisha, due to infrastructure and mining activities, that is where the habitat fragmentation has happened and the basic migration, out migration of elephants has happened. Now we come to some of the species in use and then the protected areas in, right? Why more elephant are present in the Western Ghats? Because of dense vegetation, ideal climatic condition. Now, dense vegetation means better food availability and better habitat presence. That is why. Now, 23 for 23 initiative. Now, this is a initiative which is launched by the government in order to raise the awareness for the snow leopard. So, that is to mark the International Snow Leopard Day. So that is where nationwide 23 for 23 initiative had been carried out. Now, what is this 23 for 23 initiative? To engage in the youth or the public basically and are encouraged across the country to be engaged in physical activities for about 23 minutes to raise the awareness for conservation of snow leopards and their fragile. So that is the what is celebrated for International Snow Leopard Day. Now, recently, India had concluded the census for for the snow leopards in our country. Maximum amount or population of snow leopards was to be found where in the region of Ladakh. Okay, Ladakh, 477 individuals of snow leopard, that is the highest. Then that is followed by Uttarakhand with 71 snow leopards. That is followed by Arunachal and Sikkim, 61. That is followed by Jammu and Kashmir, that is 58. And that is to be followed by Uttar Pradesh. So this is the population distribution of snow leopards in India. Now, snow leopards overall, there are 12 range countries in Central Asia and India where you find snow leopards. Okay, so basically, here a reaffirmation of India's dedication to the goals of Global Snow Leopard and Ecosystem Protection Program, that is GSLEP. India's commitment to GSLEP, so that is being reaffirmed by this initiative as well. What is GSLEP? We will take a look into. So, which are the organizations which are responsible for the 23 by 23 initiative? That is MOEFCC, supported by WWF India, Snow Leopard Trust, local communities under the project Snow Leopard. Now, GSLEP was basically initiated from the wish or the thinking of conservation of snow leopard, which is considered to be a flagship species. Flagship species are those kind of species whose conservation imparts a larger message as well. So, when we talk about conservation of snow leopard, it imparts a larger message for the conservation of high altitude ecosystem. That is where they are found. Now, this was an agreement, GSLEP was basically an agreement which was signed as a result of the Bishkek Declaration in 2013. Bishkek is where in the Kyrgyz Republic, the 12 snow leopard range countries, they adopted the Bishkek Declaration on the conservation of snow leopard. It is in Bishkek where the secretariat of GSLEP also lies. Now, which are the 12 countries? The subcontinent, other than Bangladesh, obviously, Afghanistan, China, Russia, and then you have the Central Asian republics, other than Turkmenistan, right? Mongolia is also there. So basically, Afghanistan, Bhutan, China, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So easy to remember. That is, if you take a look at the subcontinent, barring the region of Bangladesh, so Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Afghanistan, Mongolia, Russia, and the Central Asian republics, that is Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. So these are the 12 countries where snow leopard is to be found. Secretariat is at Bishkek in the Kyrgyz Republic. And here the program is supported by the Global Support Company, TSC. Okay, transboundary technical help, the better research activities, etc. Now, as per GSLEP, there is Secure 20 by 20 mission. What is Secure 20 by 2020? So the aim was to secure at least 20 snow leopard landscapes. Again, landscape based conservation. What are landscapes? Landscapes where at least 100 breeding age snow leopards could be found, involvement of local community, sufficient prey population. So, such 20 landscapes to be identified and conserved by the year 2020. That was the aim of the Bishkek Declaration, which was signed in when 2013. Okay. Now, developing management plans for priority landscape, strengthening protected areas. This is the outcome. Now, snow leopard, IUCN vulnerable. Vulnerable. Now they are the big cats of the mountains. They are carnivores, specifically carnivores. Okay. Now, then you have Project Sloth Bear. Project Sloth Bear, which was also a program which was initiated on the eve of the World Wildlife Week, and this was to conserve the population of sloth bear. Sloth bear, mostly nocturnal, that is, they rest during the day hours and they become active at dusk. Now they search for insects, fruits, or honey. Now in India, they are found in large proportion as well. Right? It is endemic to the Indian subcontinent and is found across 20 Indian states listed as vulnerable as per IUCN. Here also, the risk that they face is the shrinking habitats, fragmentation of the habitats, and deforestation. Now, Project Sloth Bear will be operational for 2025 up till around 2030. So, whichever regions are experiencing man animal conflict, etc., that will be mapped carefully. Okay. And led by Wildlife Institute of India and implemented by 16 state forest departments for the conservation and better research activities when it comes to the uh, sloth bear. Then, painted stork, that has been in news. So, after a period of 4 years, 4 year hiatus, a pair of painted storks have been spotted in the Kaziranga National Park and Tiger Reserve. The painted storks are to be found across the plains of tropical Asia, from Indian subcontinent to the south of Himalayas. That is where they are found across the plain regions. They favor the freshwater wetlands, but they also are to be found across irrigational channels, the canals that are there, agricultural fields, paddy fields. When you carry out flood irrigation, there also you will find pain. They are not migratory, right? So even though they appear very similar to migratory species, they are not migratory and only make short distance movement from one part to another. They are carnivores. They consume fishes. Okay, that is where they are carnivores. And diet mainly consists of small fish, crustaceans, amphibians, insects, and reptiles. Is per IUCN near threatened. Males and females, they are not sexually dimorphic. What is the meaning of not sexually dimorphic? Basically means that they are in appearance wise very similar. Okay, male and female, they don't have a distinct appearance. For black buck, you will find a distinct appearance. For painted stork, you won't find a distinct appearance. Only difference, the male storks tend to be slightly larger. That's it. Otherwise, they are mostly similar in terms of appearance. Then you have Apteryctus kanyakumari as a new species of finless snake eel that was found across the Kolachal coastline. Kolachal in the region of Kanyakumari itself. So, researchers from the National Bureau of Fish Genetic Resources, they have discovered a new species of finless snake eel and named it after Kanyakumari. Which kind of question can be asked from this? That Apteryctus kanyakumari is a species of fish, eel, bird, amphibian like that. So there you have to be prepared. It is a case of a finless snake eel. Okay. Now, here, this is where it has been found across the Kolachal coastline. Okay. So it has a distinct golden yellow body coloration, ventral side of the head pale white, three black blotches. So that is the physical appearance of Apteryctus kanyakumari. Then Indian wolf, for the first time, has been studied separately and in greater distinct detail by IUCN. Now, India has already established the first wolf sanctuary. We have discussed it in the past as well. Now, where is it situated? You basically have the wolf sanctuary in the state of Jharkhand. In the Latehar district, you have the Mahwadanar wolf sanctuary, which is present in the state of Jharkhand, right? Jharkhand. That is where the wolf sanctuary has been established. Now, Indian wolf, IUCN for the first time evaluated the Indian wolf. It is a subspecies of the great gray wolf that is found in the subcontinent of Indian subcontinent and Southwest Asia. Now, it prefers scrubland, semi arid regions, pastoral agro ecosystems. They live in smaller packs, rarely beyond eight subspecies or eight individuals. So, they live in smaller packs. They are slightly less vocal and have rarely been found to howl. Right. Now, the IUCN Vulnerable Sites Appendix 1, and as per Wildlife Protection Act, they are provided conservation as per Schedule 1. They are found in India, Pakistan, the entirety of the subcontinent, and even in Southwest Asia and West Asia, Turkey, Iran, Syria, Israel. There also you find the species. Blackbuck. Now, blackbuck is a species which is venerated, worshipped in the region of Rajasthan. The Bishnoi community is famous for worshipping of blackbuck. Now, blackbuck population was reintroduced in the region of Chhattisgarh, excuse me, in the region of Parnavapara Sanctuary. Now, where is it situated? I will tell you the location also. Now, there the population has thrived. Okay, so there the population of the black buck has thrived based upon the local vegetation also, which has been very robust. It is a species of antelope native to India and Nepal. Excuse me. Now, it is widespread in the states of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, the entirety of central India. You will find a large amount of blackbuck population. It is the state animal of three different states, that is Punjab, Haryana, and Andhra Pradesh. This is relevant for your prelims. Blackbuck, state animal for three different states. They live in open grasslands, dry scrub areas, and thinly forested regions. This is the Barnavapara Wildlife Sanctuary. It is in the region. Here is Raipur, the capital, and here is the important city of Bilaspur. So that is where the Barnavapara. So here you have a robust semi-arid grassland ecosystem. That is where the reintroduction has been successful. So here, the spiraling horns are a unique feature of black buck. Oftentimes, they can grow more than 20 inches. Only male population of the black bucks will have these swirling, twisting horns. Right now, IUCN red list. It is off. Okay, Carabid beetle. They have turned out to be a kind of a bioindicator for microplastic. Now, these carabid beetle, when we say bioindicator, right? So, what does that mean? So basically, that gives you an idea about the presence of microplastic. Microplastic, we know, is increasingly being prominent across the region from mountains to oceans to even subsoil regions. Everywhere you find microplastic. Now, that can be harmful for the crop cultivation for the various species of animals as well. So, carabid beetle, when they turn out to be bioindicators, that basically means it will give us an idea where to restore the natural ecosystem. Now, what is this carabid beetle? Commonly known as ground beetle, right? Now, they strongly influence the food web structure. They are often as key predators or the prey species for the larger species like the lizards and etc. They are found in wide variety of habitats like grasslands, agricultural fields, irrigated areas, right? And they also are adapted to wide climatic conditions from temperate to the tropical regions as well. They have a very pungent smell that you would also have experienced whenever you threaten the carabid beetle. They emit a very pungent smell. Now, farmers are fond of them because of their large appetite by snacking on variety of pests including snails, caterpillars, slugs, and other small invertebrates. In soil, they have a tendency to accumulate the microplastics, and that is why carabid beetles are of greater help. Now, some of the protected areas, the three protected areas which have been in news, Ramsar site, two of the Bihar's wetlands have been identified as the Ramsar site. Now, just to give you a basic idea, uh, right, related to microplastic, one bacteria or some species, there are multiple of those microbes which have been found to be, some of the microbes which have been found to be consuming the Microplastics. Yes, there have been few of them. Correct. Salman Khan case related to Blackbuck. Well, that is a controversial statement. We'll just talk about the Blackbuck reintroduction program in Chhattisgarh, and we will presume that nobody from entertainment industry is reading that news headlines for the protection and conservation of Blackbuck. Now, Ramsar sites. When we talk about Ramsar sites, so these are those wetlands which require or which have been identified across the globe for better conservation practices. That is the case of the Ramsar site. Now, this is identified as per the outcome of 1971 Ramsar Convention. Ramsar Convention. Okay. It is under the provision of the Ramsar Convention that you have the identification. Now, what is the benefit of being recognized as the Ramsar site? The benefit is simple and straightforward. Increased recognition basically means you will have increased funding, increased awareness. And when you have increased funding and awareness, that is automatically going to bring about increased level of conservation. Now, Ramsar Convention is a convention of wetlands which was signed in 1971. It basically was started in 1962 itself, with the Mar conference being held in Vienna. Mar basically representing marshes. Okay. The negotiation for the convention started in 1962. Now, after that, you had the signing of the convention in 19. It is not a regulatory regime. It came into force in 1975. So this is the overall chronology of it. 1962, Mar Conference calling for International Treaty for Wetlands. The text for the Ramsar Convention was negotiated in the next decade. Ramsar Convention took place in 1971. 18 nations agreed to Convention on Wetlands for international importance, especially of the waterfowl habitat. Australia was the first country to accede to the convention in 1974. And, India became the contracting party in 1981. Chilika Lake and Kyoladev National Park were declared as the Ramsar sites. First Ramsar site was declared in 1974 in Australia, that is in Kaborg Peninsula. Convention came into force in 1975. UNESCO is the depository. So that is the overall timeline. Okay. The PDF of all of this will be provided on the Telegram network. Now, on what basis is a wetland identified as a Ramsar site? Why isn't it that every wetland is a Ramsar site? There needs to be certain criteria which needs to be fulfilled. By the way, highest number of Ramsar sites are situated in which country? That is in UK. In UK, you have the largest number of Ramsar sites which are there. Okay. Now, here, what should be the criteria? So, these wetlands, many of the times they host migratory species of birds. Many of the times they host certain species in their evolutionary stages, in their reproductive stages, in their expansive stages, in their larval stages. Many of the times, some of the wetlands, like the reservoirs, the larger lakes and ponds, they have unique species of fishes. They have the unique species of birds. In either of the cases, a region can be identified as the Ramsar. So proposal of that for a wetland is prepared and is submitted to the Secretariat for the convention, to the Ramsar Convention. And that is when, after going through the entire records and the entire aspect, then a region is identified or given the identification as a Ramsar site. Okay. So group A, so you don't need to learn the criterias, but you need to be aware of the sites containing representative rare or unique wetland species, right? So if it contains a unique example of natural or near natural wetland type, it need not always be natural. Even man-made reservoirs can be Ramsar sites. Natural wetland type found within a biogeographic region. So a wetland should be considered internationally important if it is able to support vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered or threatened species, right? If it supports populations of plants or animal species, important for maintaining the biological diversity of a region. If it supports plants or animal species at a critical stage in their life cycle, and the larval stage or so. If it regularly supports 20,000 or more water birds or waterfowl, if it supports 1% of the individuals in a population or one species or subspecies of water bird, if it does include indigenous fish subspecies, species or families, life history stages, species interactions, or populations that are representative of wetlands benefits, or if it is considered to be spawning ground, nursery, or migration path for the fish stock, and so on. Or otherwise, 1% of individuals in a population of any of the species, of any of the taxa, if it is able to support, that is the Ramsar site. That is the criteria. Okay. So, based upon this criteria, you have the identification of wetlands as Ramsar sites. How many Ramsar sites do we have in India now? Do let me know in the comment section. Now, in Bihar, two new wetlands have been designated as Ramsar sites. One is the case of Gokul Jalashay in the Buxar district, which is an oxbow lake to the southern edge of River Ganga. And during flooding events, the wetland acts as a buffer. It absorbs the excess water, does not allow the villages to get flooded. Over 50 of the bird species are to be found at the sites, and local community that is heavily reliant on the Gokul Jalashay. So, where is it situated? The Buxar district in the region of Bihar. Okay. Then we have 93 of the Ramsar sites in India, not 83, 93. Then Udaipur Jheel in the West Champaran district. So there also you have wide diversity of plant species, right? Plant species and also migratory species of birds that are also found. So Gokul Jalashay and Udaipur Jheel. So Udaipur Jheel in the northwestern part of Bihar and Gokul Jalashay in the southern part of Bihar. Then Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve was in news because in the fifth World Network of Biosphere Reserves. So basically, in the meeting, that is the fifth WCBR, there, the Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve was designated as India's the case of World Network of Biosphere Reserve. So UNESCO officially announced the designation of the Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve as a part of World Network of Biosphere Reserve. Right now, understand one thing. In India, you have around 18 biosphere reserves. I will show you the list of all the biosphere reserves in India as well. Not all of them have met a standard in terms of uh, diversity, in terms of conservation standard, in terms of allocating resources for research and development, for awareness raising, for sustainability. Those which meet that criteria, they are made a part of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. So across the globe, in this particular meeting, 26 biosphere reserves were made a part of the World Network of Biosphere Reserve. And this was held when, in which meeting? Fifth World Congress of Biosphere Reserves, which was held in Hangzhou, China. Right? World Congress of Biosphere Reserve that was held in China. So in that, India's Cold Biosphere Reserve, Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve was added to the list. Right? So what are biosphere reserves? Learning places for sustainable development, for interdisciplinary approaches for conservation, raising awareness, sustainability, research, development, right? They integrate conservation of biodiversity and cultural diversity, economic development that is socially, culturally, and economically, environmentally sustainable, logistical support overall. Now, these are the various biosphere reserves in our country. Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve is situated in Himachal Pradesh. In Uttarakhand, you have the Nanda Devi Biosphere. Then in Sikkim, you have the Kanchenjunga Biosphere Reserve. In Assam, you have Manas and Dibru Saikova. These are the two biosphere reserves in Assam. Then in Arunachal, you have the Dehang and the Dibang. Then you have Nokrek in Meghalaya. Nokrek is present in Meghalaya. Sundarbans in West Bengal. Timlipal, Odisha. vital elephant corridor, vital tiger corridor, and tiger reserve. Then after that, Achanakmar Amarkantak, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh from the region of Bilaspur onwards, further westwards into Madhya Pradesh. Then Panchmadi and Panna in Madhya Pradesh, Kutch in Gujarat. Other than that, Sheshchalam region, the red sanders zone in Andhra Pradesh, Nilgiri in Karnataka, then Gulf of Mannar in Tamil Nadu, Agastya Malay in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and Great Nicobar in the part of Nicobar Island. So these are the various biosphere reserves in our country. Which is the largest biosphere reserve in the country? The largest biosphere reserve will be the Kutch Biosphere. Okay? The run of Kutch Biosphere Reserve in terms of area. That is the largest. And the smallest one, let me know which is the smallest biosphere reserve of India. Let me know in the comment section. Then, biosphere reserve generally have a concentric formation. You have the core zone, which is oftentimes undisturbed. Then you have the buffer zone, and then you have the transition area. That is the structure of the biosphere reserve. Now, cold desert biosphere reserve, basically spanning for 7770 square kilometer, 7,770 square kilometer, and it is ranging in altitude from 3,300 to 6,600 meters, right? Now, it encompasses the plateaus, glacial valleys in the Lahaul Spiti region. So, it includes Pin Valley National Park, Chandratal and Sarchu, and the Kibber Wildlife Sanctuary, the region around Himachal Pradesh. 732 species of vascular plants, 30 of them being endemic in that region: snow leopard, Himalayan ibex, blue sheep, Himalayan wolf, right? Himalayan snowcock, golden eagle, all of them can be found. Now, take a look at the question. The Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve includes which three distinct protected areas or sites? Sundarban, Gulf of Mannar, and Pork Bay, Pin Valley and Kibber Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaziranga, Pin Valley and Chandratal, Nilgiri, Nanda Devi, and Manas. So again, it would be simple, very easy to solve. So in this, the correct answer is going to be B, that is Pin Valley and the Kibber Wildlife Sanctuary. So that is the part of Cold Desert Biosphere Reserve, B. Okay. Now, the last topic, the last protected area, that is the Dugong Sanctuary. Dugong Sanctuary was in news basically, but that was identified by IUCN as well. Now, in order to protect the dugong, the Tamil Nadu government has declared 500 square kilometer region in the area of Pork Bay, which is very rich in biodiversity, that as a dugong reserve, right? In the region of the Gulf of Mannar and Pork Bay. Now, dugong, this is also referred to as sometimes as marine, as a sea cow. It is a marine herbivore mammal that is to be found to be consuming seagrass. So that is the case of the dugong species. This is where the Dugong Conservation Reserve has been created. Okay, the region of Pork Bay. This is your Pork Strait. Okay, that is where it is created. Dugong is a herbivore marine mammal, feeds exclusively on seagrass. It can eat up till 40 kg of seagrass every day. So that is why it is very prone to damage, because it has got a specialized niche, seagrass. Now, seagrass will be found in coastal areas. In coastal areas, if you have pollution, if you have infrastructure building, seagrass is gone. So that is why dugongs are always considered to be threatened. As per IUCN, it is vulnerable. In India, to be found in the region of the Pork Bay, Gulf of Mannar, and even in the region around Great Nicobar. That is where you will find. Okay, that brings us to the end of the discussion for all the current affairs for environment ecology in the month of October. Please revise them. Otherwise, there will be no use and you will forget them very quickly. The more number of times that you revise, better you will be in retaining them and acing the prelims exam as well. I hope the session has been helpful and you have gained some amount of content. And if you have liked the session, put that in the comment section and bless us with the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, do take care. Goodbye. Thank you.